Hi, my name's Kevin Hicks. Welcome to the History Squad. Now today we're on location at the Saskatoon Museum of Military Artifacts, where I'm a volunteer. And we're in the First World War section, right in the middle, the heart of Canada, would you believe? And as you can see, I'm dressed for the occasion. Now, the First World War, what a vast subject to try and cover. 4 years of absolute sheer hell. Was it 1914 to 1918? Not including the Russian bit on the end. It's estimated nowadays that somewhere around 1 million British and Commonwealth forces were killed in the First World War, with over 2 million being seriously wounded, and then round up to around 40,000 amputees. But what we're going to do today is we're going to concentrate on the frontline surgeons and medical officers and staff who were literally there just behind the trenches, and we're going to concentrate on the Ypres salient in Belgium. Ypres salient, what a salient is, just to explain, it's a piece of ground that juts into the enemy. That meant that the Germans were on 3 sides of the Ypres salient. You were never safe from artillery. And during the Third Battle of Ypres, 1917, 70,000 men were killed and 500,000 were wounded in that month-long offensive. That's 8,000 a day. How on earth did the medical services just behind those trenches deal with it? They were under fire. Now, can you imagine a modern emergency room in a hospital? They might have dozens upon dozens of people in. There might be a freeway or a motorway accident. They could be overwhelmed with dozens and dozens of patients coming in. They might have to put in 40 to 50 emergency admissions actually into the hospital. 8,000 a day just behind the front line. That's your medical officer, what he has to deal with. Now, the reason I've dressed like this is because the patients that the medical officer would have had in the regimental aid post just behind the front line, his patients weren't coming in as if they're in their pajamas, had a shower this morning. These guys have been fighting. Look at the kit I'm wearing. Respirator, extra ammunition, all of my equipment on my back. Small pack, rifle, bayonet, water flask, steel helmet. If I'm blown up in the air and then I land, I don't land comfortably. Chest stove in. Maybe I've ruptured something behind, kidneys, that kind of thing. That's before you actually get to the wound. If you're hit by a bullet, I've actually got a First World War bullet here that was removed from a patient. Old Basil in the corner, we've got our whole thing about him. They gave him the bullet from his wound. But it's all nice and clean and it's nice to see. But when the bullet hits you, what if it hits you here? Goes through your ammunition, through your respirator, through your tunic, through your shirt, and through your vest underneath, taking shreds of it with you. What if you've got lice? What if you haven't had a bath for 3 weeks? What if you've been in that front line for days upon days covered in mud? You see, those medical doctors, those surgeons, they didn't have antibiotics. This is 100 years ago. What they did, though, was incredible, especially for the last 2 years of the First World War. The advances they made with medicine and surgery, well, many of us to this day owe our lives to those pioneering surgeons of the First World War. Before we look into what happened to a soldier, a serviceman who'd been wounded, let's have a look at the type of wounds that he may receive. There is the bayonet, when somebody sticks one of these into you. Those were a very low percentage of wounds because, from what I've learnt, these actually prove fatal. I'm just going to put this to one side because I want to show you the bullet, of course. Very straightforward, no problems. Well, there is if you've been shot with it. But have a look at this tiny little fragment. This is a piece of fragment of a shell. An explosive shell. It's exploded in the air and this has hit you. It could be fatal if it hits you in the head, if it hits you in the chest. Ouch, you're in big trouble. But let me show you another piece. How about this hitting you? Now you would think this could prove fatal, but what if it only hit you here? And when it hit you, it was glowing red hot, so it seared the wound as well. They've got to deal with this. Or what if it's in the abdomen and it has seared itself, it's sealed in? The guy's going to be in agony, he's going to be burnt. And let me show you the actual explosive shell itself. Oh, this is a British 18-pounder. That is a piece of shrapnel. But this is filled with shrapnel balls. Almost 400 of them. And when this explodes in the air, these rain down. On top of this, you've got the heavy explosive shells. Let me just put this back, it's heavy. And they will blast people apart, terrible. And then barbed wire. Now I picked this barbed wire up before a farmer ploughed it into the ground. It was off a machine gun post on the lip of the crater at Beaumont Hamel on Hawthorne Ridge on the Somme. The spikes are long, sharp, close together. You can't put your hands in between it. This was designed by the Germans to injure soldiers. It's not the British version, which was just for cattle. So you're charging forward, you're hit, you drop into the ground. That ground of Belgium and France has been ploughed for over 600 years with animal feces, animal dung. The ground itself was alive with tetanus. Now, if you're still conscious once you've been hit, you might be able to dress your own wound. In a pocket inside your tunic, there is the first field dressing. You've got to undo it. Well, you've got to get it out first. And inside here is a little tube. And this has got iodine in it, a little glass vial. So you've got to pull out the cotton wool, forgot what it was called, and then just blow the little tube out. I know what had happened to Kev. Yeah, I'm lying there, I'm shaking, you're in shock, I blow it. There it goes. Once you've got it, snap it, pour the iodine into the wound or onto the dressing. And the dressing is quite straightforward. It's a cotton wool and gauze pad with bandage. So you've got to get that onto your wound as best you can. But I will tell you from bitter experience, having been hurt, is you're shaking like a leaf. But hey, it's there. But let's take a subject. Our soldier. He's not part of an offensive. In other words, there aren't thousands of guys going over the top, being machine gunned down, attacking the Germans. Let's say he's on a patrol in the middle of the night. He's in no man's land. He's got most of the kit. It's November. All of a sudden, boom. He's been seen by the enemy. They're firing mortars at them and he gets hit. The bottom of his foot is literally blown away. His boot is missing. He is in agony. He's in shock. He's landed in a shell hole filled with ice cold water. He may have even broken the ice as he half fell in. He's landed on his back, or maybe he's landed on his chest. If it's 1917, his respirator's here, and that will have pushed into his chest. But what if he's got his respirator on because there's been a gas attack? This guy is in a bad way. Luckily for him, a couple of his buddies saw him go down. So they creep over the parapet of the trench. They don't stand up then with a nice stretcher like we've got here. They've got to grab their buddy and drag him back. He will be in agony. That foot will be dropping into the mud. What if toes are hanging off? But as soon as they get him into the trench, he's shaking now. He's got shock, maybe going into hypothermic shock. They need to get him to the regimental aid post, 200 yards behind the line. Stretcher bearers, stretcher bearers. So they will come with their stretcher, get him on. They've got to get him out the trench. It's not easy because the trenches weren't designed to evacuate casualties. They're a fighting station. So down the narrow communication trench into the regimental aid post where a doctor will be waiting for him. He will assess you. With a bit of luck, you're the first casualty of the night. He will not have a surgical role here. His job is basically first aid. He might cut some of that horrible toes that are hanging off. He will clean the wound. He will bandage it. He will then wrap you in blankets, even a hot water bottle or two. He's got to get you warmed up. Your kit will have been removed by then. Otherwise, it's going to be impossible to move you around, isn't it? He will be given maybe brandy. There were comforts, cocoa, cigarette if you want one. And then moving on down the line to the next stage in the process, because they knew, especially in the latter half of World War I, the Great War, they knew the golden hour. If you can get him to surgery within that hour, there's a chance of saving his life. They were also very conscious that if that wound is left untreated, gangrene. The medical officer in the regimental aid post, he will have orderlies and stretcher bearers. So he's not there just on his own. But you imagine our casualty with that wounded foot. He's been bound, he's on the stretcher. He will have had a shot of morphine for the pain and also a tetanus injection. They were very, very keen to fight against these infections. But if you were a walking wounded, let's say you've had a bullet through the shoulder, straight in, straight out. It's plugged, it's not bleeding, you've got a bit of morphine, tetanus. You're going to walk the rest of the way to the advanced dressing station. You're going to walk under your own steam. You might follow the stretcher bearers. There might be 2 or 3 of you going along, just helping each other. It's quite amazing, but this medical officer in this regimental aid post, he'll be looking for malingerers as well. So you've got a guy who's full of shell shock. Is he bluffing it or is it real? But if a guy's just cut himself on barbed wire, he needs to go to the regimental aid post. He needs to have it cleaned. He needs to have the tetanus. He needs to have it dressed. Then he can go straight back on duty. So you didn't go to the regimental aid post and then were automatically sent further down the line. Not at all. These medical officers that were there, these doctors in the regimental aid post, they could do some serious stuff. If you imagine you've got a guy brought in on a stretcher or by his friends and he's got an open chest wound, a sucking chest wound. These doctors could deal with that. If there was arterial bleeding, they could deal with that, need things to be stitched up. And if there's a fractured femur, they had that wonderful splint, the Thomas splint, which was basically a wire reinforcement on both sides of the leg. And they could stretch the leg, pull the leg down and fasten it in place so that when you're on the journey to the advanced dressing station, the leg isn't rocking and they're the 2 pieces of broken bone grinding together and causing more internal damage. They really did learn a lot from the First World War. So you go to the advanced dressing station, you're lying on your stretcher, but think about this. You're lying on your back. You're looking up into the air. All of your kit's gone now. You're not feeling too much pain, but you're still cold and you're in shock. And you're looking up. Star shells bursting. Explosions here and there. The night sky of the front line is alive. An explosion lands nearby. Maybe one of the stretcher bearers tumbles or he's blown off his feet. What if one of them's wounded? They have to get a replacement stretcher bearer. They have to get another stretcher bearer team for him. Eventually, you might be lucky. After 10, 15, 20 minutes, you arrive at the advanced dressing station. You're now leaving your own battalion. You're now in the arms of the medical services in the British Army. It's the Royal Army Medical Corps, and I do personally owe them a debt of gratitude, that's for sure. At the advanced dressing stations, which were normally about 400 yards behind the front line, still within shot, within range of the artillery for sure. These dressing stations were housed in bunkers, derelict buildings, even dugouts in the ground. They offered some protection against artillery explosions and aerial bombardment. They were better equipped than the regimental aid station, but still they could offer no proper surgical facilities. Now our casualty, our soldier, he arrives at the advanced dressing station and he may be given another shot of tetanus. because one of the problems is keeping records. He's not going to be actually on proper records until he gets further down the line. What he might have now is a wounded tag. Tells you where he's been wounded, and they might make a note on the back. He's had a shot of tetanus, but in fact he's had 2. And this was a bit of a problem, was overdosing these guys. But apparently, if you have like one after the other and then another, you could go into anaphylactic shock. And it was one of these things they were learning about on moving the casualties down the line. Now, our soldier, he's at the advanced dressing station. He's been assessed, he's tagged, he's been given another tetanus, bless him. Now he's going on down to the main dressing station. Might only be a mile away. If he's lucky, there's an ambulance, so he doesn't have to be carried that mile. Now, once you arrive at the main dressing station, they are still not a full surgical unit, but they carried a surgical instrument roll, just like the one we've got here at the museum, and we're very lucky to have this. Also, sterilization equipment, so they could perform life-saving surgery. Guys who were opened up, arterial bleeding started again. They were very capable of doing that and removing limbs that have been shattered and are hanging off, and yet they're still under fire. In fact, 2 of the most famous of the advanced dressing stations on the Ypres salient, you got the one at Essex Farm and the other one at Lichterhoek, which were 2 advanced dressing stations actually in captured German bunkers, if I remember correctly. You can tell where they are nowadays. The bunkers are still there, but thousands of men are buried next to them. These are the men who arrived at the advanced dressing station, either had to wait their turn but didn't make it, or simply were dead on arrival or died under the knife. They're incredible places to visit. And now our soldier's lucky, it's not an offensive, he's slipping through the system quite nicely. His next stage is a field ambulance, which is basically a field hospital. These were mobile. Here they would have blood transfusion, they will have x-rays. This is an actual hospital on the move. But it's also the place where you will be properly assessed. This is where they use the triage system. Now, the British borrowed it from the French, and it had been going before the First World War, but it was during the First World War it really came into use. You were prioritized as trivial, treatable, or terrible. And as you can imagine, terrible, you're given morphine, you're made comfortable, and you're put to one side to die. One of these who was put to die was in the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, none other than Captain Robert Graves, the poet and writer. His commanding officer sent a letter to his mother. I'm terribly sorry to inform you that your son's been killed. You see, he had a shrapnel wound in the chest and it was quite serious. But Robert Graves actually wrote to the Times to let everybody know that he was alive and kicking and recovering from his wounds in a hospital in London and hoped to see everybody soon. So they didn't always get the triage right, but there was something that they did get right, and they had to do it properly. And that's just before you, as the casualty, leave the field hospital. That is the orderly who books you out. In front of his desk was a big poster of a man's body and arrows pointing to the different areas where you could be wounded. If you're wounded in the chest, he would make sure you were evacuated to the base hospital that dealt with chest and abdominal wounds. If you got one in the head, you go to the right hospital for head wounds. Our chap, he's going to lose his foot. He has got to go to the hospital that deals with amputation. Isn't that fantastic? Because at the beginning of the war, you could just end up in a hospital and jumbled up. But now, from 1917, you end up in the correct hospital. Now, in the case of our soldier, he might be transported on a hospital train, special trains built just to remove casualties. But if he was really lucky, he could be transported down the canal system in a specially converted hospital barge. These were great because you weren't rocked about too much. The journey was much smoother. Eventually, he would arrive at the base hospital that specialised in amputations and amputees. Or if he was lucky, he may even be back in England, in Blighty, on a hospital ship. Interestingly, when you went to Blighty, if you were from London, they would often put you in a hospital in Scotland. They didn't want the relatives clogging up the corridors. If you go back to those advanced dressing stations and to the regimental aid posts, those medical officers were incredibly brave, you know, performing the most incredible treatments under fire. If you take one particular captain, MO, Captain Noel Chivas, he was awarded the Victoria Cross twice. Now, the Victoria Cross is the highest the British and Commonwealth forces could give, and he was awarded it twice. However, he was wounded in the abdomen and died after surgery. His second Victoria Cross was awarded to him posthumously. Do you know 74 medical officers were killed in the First World War, but 241 were wounded, but there are still 4 of them missing. But the medical advancements that were made during the First World War by those medical officers and surgeons, you take the Thomas splint alone, it was to save thousands upon thousands of lives. X-ray units, mobile X-ray units, blood banks, blood transfusion units, and how surgeons in the latter part of the First World War, they started to go deeper into the body, abdominal wounds, chest wounds, head wounds, to recover those bullets and shell fragments. Before the First World War, they didn't bother if you got a bullet in the gut, you were finished. Now they're dealing with burns and gas injuries. Reconstructive surgery will come out of the First World War, and the psychological damage will be dealt with now. Shell shock. So as you can see, out of the horrors of the First World War, the Great War, medical science made giant leaps forward. Battlefield surgeons of 1914 faced impossible odds, and the psychological toll must have been incredible upon them. Yet through their bravery, their ingenuity, they saved millions of lives and changed medicine forever. But we have to remember that behind every surgical breakthrough, there was a soldier, somebody's son, father, brother, or husband, who endured unimaginable suffering, for whom war left scars that were to never heal. Well, I hope you found that video interesting. If you did, like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to support the channel further, why not have a look at joining our Patreon community? The link is in the description. Now, before I go any further, a quick shout out to some of our Patreon members. And as ever, I've got it written down on a piece of paper here.